She was 28 years old and had spent the last of her father's money on a ghost. It wasn't a spirit bound by chains, but one of iron and steel, a 10-ton locomotive lying broken in the bottom of Ophir Ravine. The Denver and Rio Grande Southern had written it off as scrap, a total loss after it jumped the tracks on the High Line and plunged 300 feet into the gorge. The men in town, gathered at the saloon or the general store, called her a fool. They laughed, a cruel and easy sound, when she filed the salvage claim, paying the railroad a token $50 for what they considered a heap of worthless, twisted metal. They said the blacksmith's daughter had finally lost her mind after her father's passing. She had no crew, no heavy equipment, and no plan they could understand. All she had was a bill of sale for a wreck, a small, worn forging hammer that fit her hand perfectly, and a belief as solid as forged steel. But what nobody knew, what the railroad agents in their clean suits and the mocking townsmen could never have guessed, was that inside the locomotive's legendary firebox, a space famed for never having gone cold in 40 years of service, lay a secret. It was a secret of heat and pressure, of sabotage and memory, a secret that would either ruin her completely or give her the power to rebuild a life from the ashes of another's. Settle in with us for this story. We're glad to have you, and we'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Grace Harlan was born to the sound of a hammer on an anvil. Her cradle, her father joked, was a clean coal bin, and her lullabies were the hiss of hot steel in the slack tub. Thomas Harlan was the blacksmith in the small Colorado town of Silverton, a man whose hands were maps of burn scars and calluses, but whose touch with iron was as delicate as a watchmaker's. He had come west with the railroad boom, shoeing mules and sharpening drill steel for the silver miners who clawed at the mountains. He was a widower, Grace's mother having been taken by a fever when Grace was just a toddler, and so the forge became their entire world. While other girls were learning needlepoint, Grace was learning the language of metal. She learned the different songs a hammer sings, the solid, resonant thump of a clean strike on yellow-hot steel, the sharp, flat clank of a blow on cold iron, the high, ringing ping of hardened tool steel. Her father taught her to read the heat by color, from the dull cherry red of a forging heat to the bright, near white of a welding heat. He taught her the heft and balance of tools, the way to hold a fuller or a swage to shape the iron without fighting it. He was a quiet man, but in the forge, he spoke a clear and patient language of work. Grace was his apprentice, his shadow, and his pride. She was small for her age, but her arms and shoulders developed a dense, corded strength from swinging a hammer day after day. The townsfolk saw her as an oddity, a girl always smudged with soot, her hair tied back in a practical knot, smelling of coal smoke and quenching oil. They didn't see the artist in her, the way she could see the shape of a perfect hinge or a graceful gate hook sleeping inside a raw bar of iron. Her father saw it. He gave her his own first hammer, a 2-pound cross peen with a hickory handle, worn smooth and dark with years of his sweat and grip. "Iron tells you what it wants to be," he told her, his voice a low rumble against the forge's roar. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen." That quiet listening became the foundation of her life. After her father's heart gave out one cold winter morning beside the forge, the silence in the smithy was a crushing weight. He had been a good smith, but a poor businessman, often trading work for a sack of potatoes or forgiving the debts of miners down on their luck. The mercantile owner and the bank held notes against the property, and without Thomas's hammer ringing, the income ceased. Grace was 28, an orphan, and for the first time, truly alone. She knew the workings of steel better than any man in town, but the world of ledgers and lawyers was a foreign country. She had inherited her father's skill and his tools, but also his debts. The community that had relied on his work for decades now saw only a liability. The women of the town committee would stop by with pies and platitudes, their eyes scanning the dusty smithy, calculating its worth, their pity a thin veneer over their judgment. The men, her father's supposed friends, spoke to her in gentle, condescending tones, advising her to sell the forge and find work as a laundress or a cook. They saw a woman adrift, not the capable smith who had been shoeing their horses and mending their plows alongside her father since she was 16. She listened to their advice with a quiet stillness they mistook for meekness, her hands clasped around the familiar handle of her father's hammer, its weight a small, solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty. She understood iron, its strengths and its breaking points. She was beginning to learn that people were much the same. Her father had left her with more than just his tools. He had left her his resilience, a quiet refusal to break. She knew she would not be a laundress. She would not be a cook. She was a blacksmith. The forge was her home, and she would not surrender it without a fight, even if the world saw her as nothing more than the soot-streaked daughter of a dead man. A relic of a life that was already over. She just needed to find a piece of iron worth fighting for, something big enough to build a new future upon. The end of her old life came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of paper. Miss Abernathy, the banker, and Silas Croft, the town's wealthiest merchant, arrived at the smithy one Tuesday morning. They did not remove their hats. Abernathy, a man whose body seemed to have been poured into his suit, held a sheaf of documents. Croft, whose face was a permanent sneer, stood slightly behind him, rocking on his heels. "Grace," Abernathy began, his tone dripping with a practiced, insincere sympathy, "we've been over the books. Your father was a fine man, but his accounts were sentimental." He slid a paper across the cluttered workbench, a ledger sheet showing a final figure circled in red ink. "The debt is considerable. The bank must be made whole." Croft stepped forward. "I've made an offer to the bank," he said, his voice flat. "I'm prepared to assume the debt in exchange for the title to the property. I need to expand my warehouse." It was an eviction notice wrapped in the language of commerce. Grace looked from the paper to their faces. She saw no sympathy, only the cold, hard lines of acquisition. There was no room for negotiation. Her father's life's work, the roar of the forge, the scent of coal, the very dust in the air, was being reduced to a number on a page. She did not plead. She did not weep. That was not her father's way. She simply nodded, her gaze clear and steady. "How much is left for me?" she asked. Abernathy consulted another paper. "After all debts are settled, the remainder is $112. He said the number as if it were a grand sum, a gift. Grace knew it was barely enough to survive a month. She took the pouch of coins without a word. She spent the rest of the day packing, not clothes, not furniture. She packed the tools. Her father's hammers, his tongs, his swages and fullers, each one wrapped carefully in oiled canvas. The last thing she packed was the small 2-pound cross-peen hammer. As she closed the lid on the heavy wooden tool chest, she heard the laughter from the street. A group of men from the saloon had heard the news. Heard Croft finally got the old smithy. One shouted, "What's the girl gonna do now?" Another called out, and they all laughed. It was in that moment, standing in the silence of her stolen home, that the idea took root. The day before, the railroad agent had posted a notice of salvage for the wreck in Ophir Ravine. Engine No. 7, Old Bess, a total loss, for sale as is, where is. The men saw it as a joke, a mountain of junk. Grace saw something else. She saw iron. A lot of it. She walked straight from the smithy to the railroad office. The heavy pouch of coins clinking in her pocket, the laughter of the town still ringing in her ears. The agent, a harried man named Clark, looked up in surprise. "I'm here about the salvage claim," Grace said, her voice even. "For engine number 7. Clark blinked. "Miss Harlan, it's a wreck. It's scrap." "I'm aware," she said, and she placed $50 in worn silver coins on his desk. "I'll take it." He stared at her, then at the money, and then he began to laugh. But he drew up the bill of sale. The journey to Ophir Ravine was a pilgrimage into exile. Grace left Silverton at dawn the next day, the town still sleeping under a blanket of cold mountain mist. She did not look back. The life she had known was contained in the heavy tool chest, roped to a handcart she pushed before her, its iron-rimmed wheels groaning under the weight. A small canvas satchel containing a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and her remaining $62 was slung over her shoulder. The road climbed out of the Animus Valley, winding its way toward the high passes. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine and cold stone. The sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Grenadiers, casting long, sharp shadows across the landscape. The world felt immense, raw, and indifferent. It was a landscape that dwarfed human concerns, and for the first time since her father's death, Grace felt a sense of release. The town, with its petty cruelties and suffocating pity, fell away behind her. Out here, there was only the work of walking, the strain in her shoulders and legs, the rhythm of her own breathing. She was no longer the blacksmith's daughter or the town eccentric. She was just a woman moving through the mountains, a small, determined figure on a vast canvas. The handcart was a stubborn beast, its wheels catching on rocks and sinking into soft patches of earth. Each mile was earned. By midday, she had reached the turnoff for the old Ophir, Telluride and Southern Grade, the abandoned rail line that led to the ravine. The tracks were long gone, pulled up for scrap years ago, but the graded path remained, a long, winding scar on the mountainside. The aspen trees grew thick along the path, their white trunks like silent sentinels, their leaves shimmering gold in the autumn light. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling high above and the steady, grinding complaint of her cart. She walked for hours, her body settling into a state of weary purpose. This was work she understood, the application of force, the overcoming of resistance, the slow, steady progress toward a goal. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, she heard a new sound, the faint, distant rush of water. She rounded a final bend, and the ground simply fell away. Before her lay Ophir Ravine, a deep, shadowed chasm carved by eons of water and ice. Far below, nestled amongst the scree and shattered pines, lay her locomotive. It looked like a child's toy dropped and broken, impossibly small and pathetic from this height. Its familiar shape was twisted and mangled, half swallowed by the earth. A plume of steam, or perhaps just mist, rose faintly from its broken form. From the ridge it looked exactly like what the town said it was, a tombstone of iron. But Grace did not see a tombstone. She saw a challenge. She unslung her satchel, took a long drink of water, and began to search for a path down into the canyon. The work was about to begin. The descent was treacherous, a controlled slide down a steep slope of loose rock and soil. Grace left her heavy cart at the top, taking only a coil of rope and her father's hammer tucked into her belt. The ravine was deeper than it looked, and the air grew cool and damp as she climbed down, the scent of wet earth and crushed pine needles thick around her. At the bottom, the roar of the creek was a constant presence. And there it was. Engine No. 7, up close, its scale was breathtaking and horrifying. It lay on its side, half buried in the mud and debris of the landslide its own crash had caused. The elegant lines Grace remembered from seeing it at the station were gone, replaced by the brutal geometry of impact. The steel frame, the very backbone of the machine, was visibly bent. The cab was a splintered ruin of wood and twisted brass. One of the massive 8-foot driving wheels had been torn clean from its axle and lay half submerged in the rushing water of the creek. Boiler cladding was peeled back like bark from a tree, revealing the insulated lagging beneath, now a sodden, useless mass. It was a scene of profound violence. Yet as Grace circled the wreck, her blacksmith's eye began its assessment. She ran her hand over the cold, pitted steel of the boiler shell, tapping it gently with the peen of her hammer. Listening, she was looking for cracks, for the telltale signs of a fatal rupture. The boiler was the engine's heart. If it was breached, the machine was truly dead. But the main shell, though dented and scraped, seemed intact. She peered into the ruined cab. The maze of pipes and levers was a tangled mess, but the great cast-iron firebox door, though askew on its hinges, was unbroken. This was the soul of the engine, the source of its legendary reputation. The crews called it Old Bess because it was reliable, but they spoke in hushed tones of its fire, which, according to railroad lore, had never been allowed to go out in 40 years of continuous service. A fresh crew would take over, but the bed of coals was always kept glowing, a living heart of heat passed from one man to the next. Even now, weeks after the crash, Grace thought she could feel a faint, residual warmth radiating from the steel, a stubborn ghost of its former life. As she was examining the firebox door, a voice startled her. Not much left to pick over. She turned to see a man standing by the creek, a burlap sack in his hand. He was tall and lean, perhaps in his late 40s, with a face weathered by sun and work. His clothes were patched, but clean. He gestured to the wreck with a nod. Railroads already stripped the brass and copper. Not much left but heavy iron. Grace straightened up, her hand resting on her hammer. I'm not a scavenger. The man raised an eyebrow. No? Then what are you? I'm the owner, she said plainly. The man's expression shifted from mild curiosity to disbelief. He looked from her small, soot-stained frame to the mountain of ruined iron and back again. You bought this? I did, Grace said. The man let out a low whistle. He walked closer, his eyes appraising her with a new intensity. My name is Walter Pike, he said. I haul freight. Used to be a mechanic for the Dienerg, before, he didn't finish the thought. You mind if I ask what a young woman like you plans to do with 10 tons of scrap iron at the bottom of a canyon? Grace met his gaze. I don't believe it's scrap, she said. The boiler's not ruptured, and I think the frame can be straightened. I'm going to pull it out of here. Walter Pike stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't laugh. Walter Pike did not laugh, but his skepticism was a palpable thing, as solid as the granite walls of the ravine. He walked the length of the locomotive, his experienced eyes tracing the lines of damage. He kicked at the buried driving wheels, ran a calloused hand over the bent frame, and peered at the undercarriage where the earth had been scoured away. The frame's twisted a good 4 inches out of true, he said, his voice a low rumble. The lead truck is sheared off. The main rods are bent into pretzels, and that's just what we can see. He looked at Grace. Pulling it out is one thing. You'd need a dozen mule teams and a logging winch. But what's the point if the boiler's shot? It's the only part that might be worth the trouble. Grace had already come to the same conclusion. Everything depended on the integrity of that boiler. Help me, she said. It wasn't a plea, but a statement of fact. Help me find out. Walter studied her again, a long, searching look. He saw not a madwoman, but someone with a familiar, stubborn set to her jaw. He saw the blacksmith's grime under her fingernails, and the professional way she held the hammer in her hand. He saw an echo of the same obstinate hope he himself had once possessed. The firebox is your only way to know for sure, he said, thinking aloud. If you can get inside, inspect the crown sheet and the stay bolts from the interior. That'll tell you if it collapsed from the impact or held its pressure. The task was monumental. The firebox was choked with debris from the crash, shattered fire bricks, tons of coal from the tender, and 40 years of accumulated ash that had been packed solid by the impact and the subsequent rains. It would take days of digging just to clear a path to the interior. I'll make you a deal, Walter said. You clear that firebox. You prove to me that boiler is sound. If it is, I'll bring my mules and my rigging. We'll see about pulling it out. He didn't believe she could do it, but he was willing to be proven wrong. Grace simply nodded. I'll need a shovel. The next day, Walter returned with a sturdy shovel and a bucket. Grace had already been at work for hours, using a piece of splintered planking to scoop out the loose debris near the firebox door. The work was slow, filthy, and backbreaking. She filled bucket after bucket with the heavy mixture of wet coal, ash, and mud, hauling them to the edge of the creek and dumping them. The sun rose high and fell again. Walter would appear in the evenings, bringing a small parcel of food, bread and jerky, and watch her progress in silence before disappearing back up the trail. The pile of excavated debris grew steadily. The town's laughter seemed a distant, irrelevant noise. Down in the ravine, there was only the scrape of the shovel, the rush of the water, and the immense, silent presence of the engine. After 4 days of relentless labor, her hands raw and her back a knot of pain, her shovel finally struck something that wasn't brick or coal. It made a dull, metallic sound. Thunk. She dug around it carefully. It wasn't a loose part. It seemed to be a plate of some kind, fixed to the floor of the ashpan, right at the back beneath the firebox grate. It was caked with rust and decades of grime, almost perfectly camouflaged. Prying at its edge with the claw of her hammer, she felt a seam give way. It wasn't a plate. It was a lid. With a final, groaning screech of metal, she heaved it open. Inside, nestled in a dry, welded compartment, was a tightly sealed oilskin pouch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted it out. It was heavy. With trembling fingers, she untied the waxed cord and unrolled the thick, stiff fabric. There was no gold, no jewels. Instead, she found a thick roll of blueprints, tied with twine. Beneath them, a leather-bound ledger, and under the ledger, a stack of banknotes, crisp and clean, bound with a paper band from the First Bank of Denver. Finally, at the very bottom, lay a single, sealed envelope. On it, in careful, elegant handwriting, were the words, "To the one who finds this." Grace carried the oilskin pouch away from the wreck, seating herself on a flat, sun-warmed rock by the creek. The water rushed past, a clean, constant sound that seemed to wash away the filth and fatigue of the past days. She untied the twine around the blueprints and carefully unrolled them. They were not the standard railroad schematics. They were detailed, hand-drawn modifications, showing subtle improvements to the valve gear, a reinforced bracing for the frame, and a unique design for the firebox arch bricks intended to improve combustion. The notes in the margins were precise, the handwriting identical to that on the envelope. Next, she opened the leather-bound ledger. The first page read, "Private Maintenance and Performance Log, Engine No. 7, Elias Vance, Senior Engineer. 1840-1880. For 40 years, this man had recorded every run, every repair, every quirk of the machine. He wrote of the engine not as a piece of equipment, but as a living partner. He detailed the sound it made climbing a steep grade, the way the injector sometimes balked in cold weather, the specific blend of coal that gave the most steam. But as she flipped through the later pages, the entries grew more troubled. Vance recorded unusual wear on the axle bearings, a recurring misalignment in the right side main rod that he had to correct after every run. He noted finding a file and metal shavings near the running gear on 2 separate occasions during his pre-run inspections. His notes became a quiet litany of suspicion. "Someone is working against her," he wrote in a spidery, tense script dated just a month before the crash. "Deliberate, systematic damage. Small things, a loosened bolt, an over-tightened grease cup, sand in an oil box. The company foreman calls me paranoid. I believe the Western Pacific wants this mail contract, and they are willing to earn it through sabotage." The stack of banknotes was next. She counted them carefully. $3,000. A fortune. Enough to buy a forge, a house, a whole new life. It was a man's life savings, tucked away in the heart of the machine he loved. Finally, she picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking slightly as she broke the wax seal. The letter inside was written on a single folded sheet of paper. October 12, 1880. If you are reading this, it means 2 things. First, that I am gone. And second, that my old Bess has finally been silenced. I hope her end was quick, and that she did not suffer long. I also hope that you, Whoever you are, have an eye for true iron and a soul that understands work. I have been the engineer on this locomotive since she was delivered from the Baldwin Works in 1840. 40 years. I have no wife, no children. This engine has been my only family. For a year now, I have known that others mean her harm, small acts of sabotage, meant to make her seem unreliable, to cause a failure that will cost my company the mail contract. I have reported it, but I am dismissed as an old man seeing ghosts. I have documented everything in my private ledger. It is my proof. I fear they will eventually succeed in causing a catastrophic failure. I cannot bear the thought of my life's work, my proof, being lost in a wreck or hauled away and melted down as scrap by men who do not understand what she was. So I have made a choice. I have hidden my life savings here, in the place I know is safest, the heart of the engine itself. It is not a great sum, but it is all I have. I have also hidden my ledger and my private designs. I do this in the hope that if the worst happens, someone with skill and patience will find this. Someone who does not see only a wreck, but sees the truth of the steel. The money is yours, to do with as you see fit. Perhaps it will be enough to salvage what is left of her. Perhaps it will be enough for you to start a new life. All I ask is that you read my ledger. Know her story. Do not let them say she failed. She was sabotaged. Her frame is true Pennsylvania iron. Her boiler is the best rolled steel of its day. Do not let them lie about her. She was a good engine. Yours in steam, Elias Vance. Grace folded the letter, her vision blurring with tears. She was no longer alone in the ravine. The ghost of Elias Vance was with her, a fellow craftsman reaching across the years. She looked from the letter to the silent, broken locomotive. It was no longer a wreck, it was a legacy. When Walter Pike arrived that evening, he found her not by the firebox, but sitting quietly by the creek. He saw the open pouch, the papers, the stack of money. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice cautious. Grace didn't speak. She simply handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, and then to a slow, burning anger. He finished, looked at the locomotive, and then back at Grace. "That boiler," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the best rolled steel of its day." He looked at her, his skepticism gone, replaced by a resolute fire. "Get your rest, Miss Harlan," he said, his voice firm. "Tomorrow we bring the mules." The rebuilding began not with a hammer, but with the quiet jingle of harness and the low commands of a man who spoke the language of animals and machines. Walter Pike returned at sunrise, not alone, but with a team of 12 massive mules, their coats gleaming in the early light. With him was a younger man, little more than a boy, named Cale, whose quiet competence with the animals was immediately apparent. The first task was not to pull, but to build. Using saws and axes, Walter and Cale felled 2 tall, straight pines from higher up the slope. Grace, using a broad axe with a skill that made Walter pause and watch, squared the logs into massive beams. Together, they constructed a heavy A-frame derrick on the slope directly above the locomotive, sinking its legs deep into the earth and anchoring it with heavy chains wrapped around the base of a thick, ancient fir tree. This was the work of physics and faith, a slow and deliberate process. News of the strange project in Ophir Ravine traveled fast. Miners from the Smuggler Union, on their way to town, would stop at the ridge and watch. At first, they were simply curious, but as the derrick rose, their curiosity turned to respect. One afternoon, an old, wiry carpenter named Jedediah, who had been watching them for days, made his way down into the ravine. "You'll need a proper sled for that thing," he said, gesturing to the engine. "A stone boat won't hold the weight. You need cross-braced runners and a solid bed." He didn't wait for an answer. The next day, he returned with his tools and, with wood they harvested, began constructing a massive sledge of seasoned oak, its joints fitted with a carpenter's precision. Grace, meanwhile, returned to her own craft. Using a small, portable forge Walter had brought from his yard, she began the work of repair. The main rods were too badly bent to be straightened, but other parts were salvageable. She would heat a twisted shackle or a bent bracket in the coals, her face lit by the orange glow, and with her father's hammer, carefully, patiently, bring it back to its true shape on a makeshift anvil. She used the money from Elias Vance's cachet to pay for supplies. A rider was sent to Durango for new, heavy-duty block and tackle sets and hundreds of feet of thick hemp rope. A woman from a nearby ranch, a widow named Mrs. Gable, began arriving each day at noon with a large basket containing hot stew, fresh bread, and a pot of coffee, refusing any payment. "Men who work that hard need to eat," was all she would say. The community was forming, not through words, but through shared labor. They were a small, dedicated army, united by the sheer magnificent impossibility of their task. The railroad men from Silverton came once, the agent clerk among them, to stand on the ridge and laugh, but their laughter sounded thin and hollow against the solid sounds of work below. The ring of Grace's hammer, the bite of Jedediah's saw, and Walter's calm, steady voice directing the placement of the first heavy lifting chains around the locomotive's boiler. The day of the great lift was a day of held breath. The whole fragile enterprise rested on Walter's knowledge of rigging and the integrity of Grace's derrick. The 12 mules were hitched not to the engine, but to the end of a complex system of ropes and pulleys that multiplied their strength tenfold. Cale stood with the led mules, his hand on their bridles, speaking to them in low, calming tones. Jedediah had positioned the massive oak sled directly below the engine's path. Grace stood beside Walter, her hand on the main anchor chain, feeling the tension build in the system. The small community of helpers, Jedediah, Mrs. Gable, and a half-dozen miners who had walked over from the camps, stood back, watching in silence. "Easy now," Walter called out, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Take up the slack." The mules leaned into their harnesses, and the ropes groaned as they grew taut. The chains cinched tight around the locomotive's boiler. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine, settled deep in the mud, resisted. Then, with a great sucking sound and the screech of protesting metal, the front end of the locomotive lifted from the earth. A cheer went up from the miners on the ridge. Inch by painful inch, the massive machine was raised, swinging slowly like a pendulum beneath the straining A-frame. Grace's eyes were fixed on the anchor chains, watching for any sign of slippage, her heart pounding in time with the rhythmic creak of the ropes. Walter, his face a mask of concentration, gave a series of precise commands, and the mules, guided by Cale, began to pull the engine sideways, swinging it out over the prepared sled. The final maneuver was the most delicate. With Walter calling out adjustments, they slowly, carefully lowered the 10-ton machine onto the oak runners. It settled with a ground-shaking thud that echoed through the ravine. It was done. The locomotive was free from the earth and resting on the sled. The first battle was won. But the war was far from over. Now came the long, arduous task of hauling it out of the ravine and back to civilization. The path out was the steep, winding railroad grade they had walked down. For the next week, that path became their world. They moved at a crawl, sometimes covering only a few hundred feet in a day. They used the mules for the gentler slopes, but for the steepest sections, they relied on a system of winching, using the derrick's block and tackle, moving it leapfrog style up the mountain, anchoring it to trees, and slowly, painstakingly, ratcheting the sled upwards. Grace and the miners labored with pry bars and levers, shifting the sled's direction, clearing rocks from its path. The work was grueling, a relentless cycle of strain and release. But with every foot of progress, a change was taking place. The locomotive, which had been a symbol of failure, was becoming a symbol of defiance. And Grace, the madwoman, was becoming their leader. They looked to her for decisions, trusting the quiet certainty in her eyes. She was no longer just the blacksmith's daughter. She was the woman who was pulling a locomotive out of a canyon. By the time they reached the top of the ridge and the flat ground of the old rail line, a small crowd had gathered. They did not laugh. They watched in silent, awestruck respect as the mud-caked engine, dragged by 12 weary mules, finally crested the rise and settled onto level ground, a resurrected beast blinking in the afternoon sun. Walter Pike walked over to Grace, a rare smile cracking his weathered face. "Well, Miss Harlan," he said, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty brow. "I believe the hard part is over." Walter's freight yard sat on the outskirts of Silverton, a sprawling, cluttered piece of land with a small workshop, a stable, and a rusty siding that connected to a branch line for the mines. It was here they brought Engine No. 7, hauling it the final few miles along the road, a slow, triumphant parade. The arrival of the locomotive at the yard marked a new beginning. The raw, outdoor labor of salvage gave way to the more intricate, focused work of restoration. The yard, once a quiet place of solitary work for Walter, became the hub of a thriving enterprise. The engine, now sitting on the siding, was the center of this new world. Grace and Walter cleaned it from top to bottom, using steam from a small auxiliary boiler to blast away the caked on mud and grime, revealing the true extent of the damage. But with the grime gone, they could also see the engine's good bones, just as Elias Vance's letter had promised. The boiler, once inspected from the inside, was declared sound by Walter. The frame, though bent, could be heated and straightened. Grace, with the $3,000 as her capital, established a proper workshop. She bought a new, larger forge and a trip hammer and sent for specialty steel from the foundries in Pueblo. Her father's tools, once the relics of a lost life, were now the instruments of a new one. She was in her element, a master of her craft. Using Vance's hidden blueprints as her guide, she began the painstaking process of forging new parts. She reforged the main rods, straightened the frame using precisely applied heat from multiple small forges in the slow, immense pressure of hydraulic jacks Walter jury-rigged. The community that had formed in the ravine did not dissipate. Jedediah the carpenter became a permanent fixture, rebuilding the wooden cab with loving detail, using fine ash and oak. Cale tended to the mules, but also became Grace's apprentice at the forge. His quiet nature a perfect match for the focused work. Mrs. Gable continued to bring meals, her deliveries becoming a cherished daily ritual. The miners from the smuggler union, now firm allies, would stop by with scavenged parts from other abandoned equipment, a usable steam gauge, a set of intact injectors. The railroad agent, Clark, came by once more. This time, he did not mock. He stood for a long time, watching Grace as she directed the heating of the main frame. Her commands clear and confident. He saw the restored parts, the new cab taking shape, the sense of purpose that hummed in the yard. He saw a working railroad engine being born from what he had declared scrap. He turned to Walter. "What does she plan to do with it?" he asked, his voice low. "Put it to work," Walter said simply. "The mines up north need a short-line hauler. The Dianerg Southern won't service that spur anymore." Clark nodded slowly, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He was not looking at a madwoman's folly. He was looking at a competitor. Grace was no longer an outcast. People in town spoke her name with a new respect. She was Grace Harlan, the woman who owned the Ophir engine. She had a place, not one she had been given, but one she had forged for herself, with iron, fire, and an unbreakable will. The yard was no longer just Walter's property. It was their shared ground, a place of work and belonging, filled with the sounds of hammers, the smell of hot metal, and the quiet hum of a community rebuilding itself around a shared purpose. Months bled into a year. The Colorado seasons turned, from the gold of that first autumn to the deep snows of winter, and back again to the tender green of spring. In the yard, the work never stopped. Engine No. 7 was transformed. It was no longer the mud-caked wreck from the ravine. It stood proud on the siding, its new paint a deep, glossy black, its polished brass gleaming in the sun. The splintered cab was now a masterpiece of carpentry, its windows fitted and its interior smelling of fresh varnish. Grace had made a decision. It would not be called Old Bess any longer. On the side of the newly rebuilt cab, in elegant gold leaf, she had painted a new name, the Elias Vance. It was a tribute, a promise kept. The final piece of the restoration was the firebox. Grace herself relined it with new fire bricks, her hands moving with a mason's skill. The day came when it was time to light the fire for the first time. It was a quiet, solemn occasion. Only Grace, Walter, Jedediah, and Cale were there. Grace herself laid the kindling and the first shovels of coal onto the grate. She struck a match, the small flame flickering in the cavernous space. The kindling caught, and a plume of white smoke, clean and pure, rose from the tall smokestack for the first time in over a year. Over the next few hours, they built the fire slowly, letting the heat soak into the cold steel of the boiler, allowing the metal to expand evenly. The pressure gauge, its needle dormant for so long, began to stir. First 10 pounds, then 50, then 100. When the pressure reached 120 pounds, Walter opened the cylinder cocks. A great blast of steam and condensed water shot out, clearing the lines. He then pulled gently on the throttle. With a deep sigh, a hiss of steam, and the slow, powerful clank of its newly forged rods, the Elias Vance moved. It rolled forward 3 feet under its own power, and then stopped. A profound silence fell over the small group, broken only by the soft panting of the air pump. Walter looked at Grace, his face shining with sweat and pride. "She's alive," he said, his voice husky. Grace stood on the ground beside the cab, her hand resting on the warm steel of the firebox. The faint, familiar vibration of the living engine traveled up her arm. It felt like a handshake across time. She reached into the pocket of her work apron and pulled out her father's hammer, its hickory handle dark and smooth. She climbed into the cab and placed the hammer on the engineer's seat, right where Elias Vance would have sat. Beside it, she set a small, framed tintype of a serious-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard, a copy she'd had made from the worn photograph she found in his oilskin pouch. The hammer from the father who taught her iron, the image of the stranger who had trusted her with his legacy. 2 men she had loved, who had believed in the truth of good work. They were both with her, here, in the warm, breathing heart of the machine she had saved. She was 29 years old, and she was home. She had $62 and a salvage claim to her name when she started. It was the best $50 she ever spent. The story of Grace Harlan and the Elias Vance did not end there. It was, in truth, just the beginning of a new chapter written in steam and steel. The short-line railroad she established, servicing the high-altitude mines that the larger companies had abandoned, became the lifeblood of the smaller mining camps in the San Juan Mountains. Grace was not just the owner. She was its chief mechanic and often its engineer. Her small, soot-smudged figure, a familiar sight in the cab, her hand steady on the throttle. Walter Pike, who had started as a skeptical observer, became her partner in every sense of the word, managing the freight business that grew around their small railroad. Their partnership was like the engine itself, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared labor, and a quiet, unspoken understanding that ran deeper than words. The ledger of Elias Vance, with its damning proof of sabotage, was never made public. Grace decided against it. Vengeance was not her way. The triumph was not in exposing the Denver and Rio Grande's past sins, but in the present reality of her success. The constant, reliable puffing of the Elias Vance on the high line, hauling ore down and supplies up, was a far more potent testament to the truth than any accusation in a newspaper could ever be. The engine's reputation for reliability surpassed even its legend as Old Bess. Grace, using Vance's improved designs, had made it stronger, more efficient, more itself. The men of the DNRG, who had once mocked her, now watched her enterprise with a grudging, bitter respect. She had not only salvaged an engine, She had salvaged a route, a market, and a future they had declared worthless. Her community of helpers remained her steadfast family. Jedediah maintained the rolling stock, Cale became a skilled fireman and Grace's trusted right hand, and Mrs. Gable's kitchen became the unofficial commissary for the Ophir Ravine short line. The laughter that had once driven Grace from Silverton was a forgotten echo. In its place was the sound of a steam whistle echoing through the canyons, a sound of defiance, of purpose, of a promise kept. In the quiet evenings, after a long day's run, Grace would often sit alone in the cab of the cooling engine, the silence of the yard settling around her. She would run her hand over the worn handle of her father's hammer and look at the small, framed portrait of Elias Vance. She had built a life not just for herself, but for them, too, a legacy of craftsmanship and integrity. The engine was more than iron and brass. It was a vessel of memory, a monument to the quiet courage of those who see value where others see only ruin. It was a testament to the simple, profound idea that the truest things are not bought or sold, but built, with patience, with skill, and with a heart that is willing to listen to the story the iron has to tell. We hope this story has brought a little warmth and light to your day. Thank you for settling in with us. We invite you to stay close for more stories of quiet courage and unexpected discoveries. Please feel free to share this story with someone who might appreciate it. And let us know in the comments below, what is something you have found or built in your own life that others might have overlooked? We look forward to reading your own stories of salvage and second chances. Until next time, be well.